At the risk of taking on an incredibly dangerous topic, we're going to be talking about Edelgard and Dimitri from Fire Emblem Three Houses today. It's certainly become one of the most popular Fire Emblem games, which has led to loads of people weighing in with their opinions in, opinionated ways. Edelgard in particular has been heavily discussed, with haters and defenders' opinions on her ranging from fascist to she did nothing wrong. Dimitri, while less controversial compared to Edelgard, still has his own villain qualities about him, and in many ways serves as a bit of a foil for her, giving the two of them an interesting comparison when viewed side by side. So let's take a look at them, see what they've done, why they've done it, and see if either of them might be justified in what they've done. And real quick before we get into the video, if you like the content, consider checking out that subscribe button. Both Edelgard and Dimitri were born in 1162, 18 years prior to the game. Edelgard as the daughter of King Ionius IX and his consort Anselma, and Dimitri as the son of King Lambert and an unnamed mother who died when he was young. Both of them inherited crests, Edelgard a minor crest of Seiros, and Dimitri a minor crest of Blaiddyd. Things would seem normal for them until 1171 and the Insurrection of the Seven. The great noble families of the Adrestian Empire and House Hrim would rebel against King Ionius, and while they didn't kill him, they reduced him to a mere puppet, with Ludwig von Eyre pulling the strings. Anselma fled the Empire to take refuge in the kingdom, where she would secretly marry King Lambert, and to maintain her secrecy would now go by Patricia while in the kingdom. At the same time, Arundel would take Edelgard and flee to the kingdom as well, telling her they were in exile from the Empire. While in the kingdom, Edelgard would meet and befriend Dimitri. He found her difficult, stubborn, and bored of everything, but eventually found a way under her facade. According to Dimitri, the year Edelgard spent in the kingdom was the time of his life. Unfortunately, though, all good things come to an end, and Edelgard and Arundel would return to the Empire. To commemorate their time together, Dimitri gave her a parting gift as she was leaving. In Fargus, blades were considered tools of destiny, so Dimitri gave her a dagger to symbolically allow her to cut a path to her own future. Edelgard was confused by the gift, and would seemingly forget all about her time spent with Dimitri. After returning to the Empire, Edelgard's life would significantly turn. Duke Eyre had installed members of those who slither in the dark into the Empire's ranks, and had been secretly performing experiments on children, trying to create people with multiple crests, with Edelgard along with her 10 siblings being among these children. They were imprisoned beneath the palace, where they were cut open and forced to undergo these brutal experiments. Edelgard would receive a second crest, a major crest of flames, at the cost of her hair color changing and her lifespan being significantly shortened. None of her siblings would survive the experiments, though, and she would deal with nightmares of what happened for years to come.
I dream of my older brother, paralyzed, helpless. My older sister crying for help that never came. The youngest babbling words beyond meaning. I see my family dying slowly, waiting in the darkest depths for a glimmer of light. I once had 10 siblings, 8 older and 2 younger. Such a large family, and yet I became the heir to the throne. Do you know why? Every last one of them was crippled by disease, or lost their mind, or died. I was the only one left who could inherit the throne.
As a result of what she went through, Edelgard would grow to hate crests and the whole crest system. Sometime before Three Houses, she would create a new persona for herself, the Flame Emperor. As the Flame Emperor, she would ally herself with shady forces such as those who slither in the dark, as well as bandits, in her attempt to topple the Church of Seiros and abolish crests for good. Dimitri would also suffer his own trauma. For him, it was the tragedy of Duscur. 4 years before the start of the game, King Lambert, alongside his wife Patricia, his son Dimitri, and several others were traveling to Duscur for some negotiations when they were attacked by an unknown group of people.
My father, my stepmother, 4 years ago, they lost their lives to those flames. I'll never forget. I still remember their faces, their screams, the tortured last moments of every person who died that day.
Dimitri miraculously managed to survive the incident, but he would be the only one. He lost his family and close friends in the attack, so he would be largely alone in the following years. The couple of people that he did manage to grow close to were Lord Rodrigue, whom he viewed as a sort of second father to him after King Lambert died, and Didieu, a Duscurian, is that what they're called? Whom Dimitri had saved from a riot after the initial attack. Much like how Edelgard would devote her life to toppling the Crest system, Dimitri would direct his hate at those behind the tragedy of Duscur. The problem was, nobody knew who was responsible. The general populace tended to blame the people from Duscur, but Dimitri was actually there and able to see the attackers, and he swore that it wasn't them. At age 17, he left for Garrigmach Officers' Academy on his quest for revenge, hoping to uncover the truth behind what happened. The game begins with some bandits hired by the Flame Emperor attacking a campsite of students attending the Officers' Academy. The leaders of the three houses, Dimitri, Edelgard, and Claude, run to the nearby village where they find Byleth and Geralt and request their help. The bandits are repelled, but in a last-ditch effort, Kostas attempts something a little bit surprising on a second playthrough and attacks Edelgard. Byleth steps in, nearly dies, awakens to Sothis and the Divine Pulse, rewinds time, and deflects Kostas' attack now that they know it's coming. The three house leaders all try to cozy up to Byleth, trying to convince them to aid their respective nations, and we can see a rivalry brewing between Edelgard and Dimitri, with Claude just happy to be there. Byleth and Geralt escort the students back to Garrigmach, where Archbishop Rhea encourages Byleth to take up a teaching position, and asks them to choose a house to teach. The Black Eagles, led by Edelgard, the Blue Lions, led by Dimitri, or the Golden Deer, led by Claude, the heir to the Leicester Alliance. The first half of the game is largely the same between routes, but I'll point out whenever any of the routes have a notable difference. Edelgard would secretly meet up with Kostas as the Flame Emperor and express her disappointment for his failure, as it resulted in Byleth's arrival at the church, and abandons him to fend for himself before Byleth would lead the students of Garrigmach to kill him in next month's mission. In Chapter 5, Edelgard has Yuritsa, in his identity as the Death Knight, kidnap Flame, as those who slither in the dark have a need for her unique blood. But Byleth and his house manage to recover Flame before any harm comes to her. After they find Flame, the Flame Emperor makes her first appearance to the monastery, where she instructs Yuritsa to retreat. Another girl is found alongside Flame, Kranya, although she is currently masquerading as a student who had gone missing from Garrigmach the previous year, Monica. Edelgard and Monica seem to form a quick friendship, and Monica can be found either talking to her or Hubert in the next few chapters. After handling an incident at Remire Village, where Tomas, a teacher at the academy, turned out to be Solon, a member of those who slither in the dark, Edelgard makes a second appearance as the Flame Emperor to the members of the Officers' Academy. She claims that while she was working alongside Solon and his allies, they did not share the same objectives, and that she would have stopped him had she known of his plans. She reaches out to Byleth and Geralt, asking them to join her, replacing her need to ally with those who slither in the dark, but our answer doesn't matter. She accuses us of lying if we say yes, and expresses disappointment if we say no. And then, in the worst narrative moment in the game in two of the routes, our house leader's second-in-command runs up to us panicking, asking if we've seen our house leader, distracting us long enough for Edelgard to escape. As for Dimitri, the first major event unique to him happens as we arrive at Remire. He enters a bit of a bloodlust as he sees what's happening, getting a flashback to the tragedy of Duscur 4 years ago. He recognizes those behind the events at Remire as the same people responsible for Duscur, and his mind goes dark. After the ball in Chapter 9, the Blue Lions route gives you an extra scene with Dimitri on the way to the date. Here he tells us about the time he spent with Edelgard as a child, ending with him telling us about the dagger as a parting gift. In the next chapter, all routes get a scene eavesdropping on Kranya, Talus, and the Flame Emperor, but in the Blue Lions route, Dimitri joins in the eavesdropping as well. Kranya and Talus discuss their ultimate plans, while the Flame Emperor expresses her disdain for those who slither in the dark, saying those responsible for the deeds in Duscur and Enbar will get no salvation. Talus reminds her that those who slither in the dark are responsible for the strength that she needs to fight the Church. In the Golden Deer and the Black Eagles routes, the scene fades out here, but in the Blue Lions route, Dimitri's neurons activate once he hears the word Duscur, and leaps out to attack the Flame Emperor. He connects the dots in his head, and reasons that since they were discussing Duscur, and she was allying herself with the ones who caused the attack, that the Flame Emperor must be responsible for the tragedy of Duscur. Edelgard defends herself with a dagger, but drops it while escaping. Dimitri picks it up and hesitates a moment as he seems to recognize it.
No, never mind. It couldn't possibly be so. Professor, those are the ones we must destroy. They're the bastards who killed my family and Geralt.
In Chapter 11, Edelgard begins to put the next step of her plans into motion. In the Black Eagles route, Byleth can accompany Edelgard on a trip back to Enbar to witness her coronation as the new Emperor of the Adrestian Empire. Her first action as Emperor is to strip Ludwig von Eyre of his powers and imprison him as punishment for what he's done. Upon returning to Garreg Mach, she tells Byleth that this may be the last they see of each other, as after the ceremony at the Holy Tomb, she will be returning to Enbar permanently. Chapter 11's mission is to visit the Holy Tomb of Seiros, as Rhea wanted Byleth to receive a gift from the goddess Sothis. Nothing happens, and Edelgard steps in to interrupt the party. Dressed up as the Flame Emperor, minus the helmet and the Black Eagles route, she leads the Imperial army to tail the Knights of Seiros into the tomb, trying to steal the crest stones inside. Byleth holds her off, and Edelgard's identity in the non-Black Eagles routes is revealed. After the fight, Rhea gives Byleth an order: kill Edelgard. If Byleth led the Black Eagles and watched Edelgard's coronation, they have the option to disobey Rhea and instead vow to protect Edelgard, leading to the Crimson Flowers route. Otherwise, Edelgard retreats, promising that the next time we meet will be on the battlefield. For the purposes of this video, Silver Snow and Verdant Wind are mostly identical, and they're going to share this section, having any notable differences pointed out along the way. A couple of weeks after the incident at the Holy Tomb, Edelgard returns to Garreg Mach with her army, and despite suffering some heavy losses, the Knights of Seiros are forced to retreat. In a desperate attempt to stop the Imperial forces, Rhea transforms into the Immaculate One, but it's not enough to drive them back, and she is captured and detained by Edelgard. In addition to the Knights of Seiros, Edelgard's actions also declared war on the Leicester Alliance and the Holy Kingdom of Fargus as well. In all routes, there's a time skip at this point, as the player insert Byleth falls into a coma and reawakens 5 years later. And in Silver Snow, Verdant Wind, and Azure Moon, Garreg Mach is overrun by bandits, and Dimitri is framed for the murder of his uncle Rufus and presumed to have been executed. In Silver Snow, Edelgard surprisingly honors the pact that she made with the Black Eagles to reunite for the Millennium Festival, and waits for Byleth at Garreg Mach. She tries to persuade Byleth to join her once again, which they are unable to agree to. She then declares us enemies and draws her sword, challenging Byleth to a duel. They reach a stalemate as they both simultaneously lay their blades across each other's neck, and Edelgard realizes that their chosen paths will never cross. She leaves, telling Byleth that when they next meet, one of them will take their last breath. The next handful of chapters in these two routes involve wrestling back control of various Fodlan territories from the Empire, but nothing of particular relevance for this video happens until Chapter 17. In Verdant Wind, Judith reports that an army marching under the House Blaethid banner was spotted marching with incredible speed near the recently conquered Bridge of Myrddin, before disappearing into Empire territory. Claude notes that tracking them through the Empire would be difficult and instead focuses on his own plans. The Alliance planned to invade the Empire themselves soon, and he suspected that Edelgard might try and intercept him at Gronder Field. Much like Claude predicted, Edelgard marches her army and meets him there, but an unexpected third party also arrives, the supposedly dead Dimitri. He's gone completely mad, and his entire being is focused on executing Edelgard as payback for the dead. Claude and Edelgard momentarily reminisce about the Battle of the Eagle and Lion, the last time they were all here, and then the second worst narrative moment of the game happens, where it tries to justify why we fought both Edelgard and Dimitri.
I will create such chaotic warfare that they won't be able to tell who is friend and who is foe.
Eventually, the Alliance comes out on top, Edelgard retreats, and Dimitri, still locked in, gives chase. However, he collapses before long and is surrounded and executed by Imperial troops.
Dimitri. He went through so much to make it here, only for his efforts to be in vain.
Dedue manages to avoid Dimitri's fate, and takes on Dimitri's ambitions and vows to bring him Edelgard's head. In Silver Snow, the battle at Gronder happens off-screen, with reports saying Edelgard sustained heavy wounds and retreated to Enbar, and that Dimitri has been counted among the dead. Whether or not this is true is up for debate though, as Dimitri greets Byleth at Garreg Mach shortly after, lamenting about the dead once again and at his failure to slit Edelgard's throat. Shortly after, Seteth walks up upon an unconscious Byleth, with Dimitri nowhere in sight, causing them to wonder whether or not it was all a dream. Edelgard awaits Byleth's army in the castle at Enbar. She has Hubert and the Death Knight defend the city, but they only serve to slow Byleth down and are ultimately killed. Byleth breaks into the palace, but Edelgard views it as the perfect opportunity for her. With all her enemies gathered at once, should she manage to turn the tables on them, she would effectively win her war on the spot. Dedue aids us in this fight, but his only wish is to fulfill Dimitri's wish and kill Edelgard. So he asks us that should he fall in battle, we abandon him and continue our mission. Edelgard is ultimately defeated, and recognizing this, encourages Byleth to claim their victory. She knows that there's no point living while she's been defeated, as that would only prolong a losing war and cause even more pain and suffering.
Your path lies across my grave. It is time for you to find the courage to walk it. If I must fall, let it be by your hand.
The last thing she says before Byleth executes her is that she wanted to walk with them.
I wanted to walk with you.
In the Blue Lion's route, we get an extra cutscene after the battle in the Holy Tomb. Edelgard's mask has fallen to the ground, revealing her face, and Dimitri steps on it, crushing it. He laughs like a maniac, threatening to hang her head from the gates of Enbar, and then rushes Edelgard, throwing his spear at her, narrowly missing her head. Her guards rush him, but he kills them with his bare hands. He presses Edelgard on her involvement in the tragedy of Duscur, which she denies, but Dimitri doesn't hear any of it. He's already made up his mind.
Let's move, Professor. Even if it costs me my life, I won't rest until I've crushed her skull in my bare hands.
As mentioned earlier, during the time skip, Dimitri is framed for the murder of his uncle Rufus and falsely imprisoned for his supposed crime. In actuality, Rufus was killed by Cornelia, who had been working with those who slither in the dark, who frames Dimitri by bringing up rumors of Rufus being involved with the tragedy of Dusker as his motive. Dedue manages to break Dimitri out of prison, and Dimitri would believe that Dedue died for this, although he would turn up later, assuming you did his paralogue. Once Byleth awakens from their coma, they find Dimitri waiting at the monastery. He doesn't mention the pact of meeting here for the Millennium Festival, but it'd be awfully coincidental for him to be here for other reasons at this exact time. He doesn't tell us exactly what he's been up to, but Gilbert fills us in on the details afterwards. Through a combination of his vendetta against Edelgard and having been imprisoned for so long, Dimitri's mind is completely gone at this point, and he is wholly consumed with the thought of ending Edelgard's life. This extends into his gameplay during this section as well. During these next few chapters, you can't do anything with him at the monastery, such as giving him gifts, eating, singing, or teaching. Much like the last two routes, the first handful of chapters post-time skip involve wrestling back territories from the Empire and defending Garreg Mach. The attack on Garreg Mach is led by an Imperial general, Randolph, but he is held back by Byleth and Dimitri's forces. In the aftermath of the battle, he is seen pleading for his life in front of Dimitri, but Dimitri is having none of it.
So, you are piling up corpses for the people and your family. And I am doing the same for the salvation of the dead. After all is said and done, we are both murderers, both stained, both monsters.
Dimitri toys with the idea of torturing Randolph before Byleth steps in and executes him themselves, granting him a merciful end and lamenting what Dimitri had become. After the battle at Aelel, the Valley of Torment, Dimitri is reunited with Lord Rodrigue, the man he considered his second father. Rodrigue tries to convince Dimitri to turn his attention towards the kingdom's territories, as they were in dire straits after being invaded by the Empire, but Dimitri's mind was already set. He wanted Edelgard's head, and tending to the kingdom would delay that goal. After taking Myrden Bridge, we adopt a girl named Flesh, who claims to be from a nearby village and that her family was gone and she had nowhere else to go. Shortly after, we have Gronder Field, which happens very similarly to Verdant Wind, except the premise makes even less sense, as Claude is theoretically of sound mind, unlike Dimitri, who at least kind of had a justification for not being able to distinguish friend from foe. After the battle, Rodrigue tries to stop Dimitri from chasing after Edelgard, but their conversation is interrupted as Flesh creeps up to the front lines. She sneaks up behind Dimitri and starts screaming at how her brother Randolph is dead because of him, and then tries to kill him. Rodrigue steps in to take the blow for Dimitri, and Byleth kills Flesh in retaliation. Rodrigue would succumb to his wounds, but leaves Dimitri with a message before dying.
Your Highness, you have one thing terribly wrong. None of them, none of us, died for you. I'm dying for what I believe in, just as they did. Your life is your own. It belongs to no other, living or dead. Live for what you believe in. Dimitri, my boy. You really do look just like His Majesty.
It takes a bit for Dimitri to process Rodrigue's words, but Byleth is able to help bring Dimitri back down to earth, and he manages to regain his composure and sanity. He is still, of course, determined to take Edelgard's head, but of his own volition, rather than a compulsion to avenge the dead. Now that he's been snapped back to reality, Dimitri is able to be reasoned with, and he is convinced to turn to Ferdiad and save his kingdom from the Empire's clutches. In the retaking of the kingdom's capital, he kills Cornelia, the one actually responsible for his trauma. In her dying words, she hints that his stepmother Patricia had some involvement in the tragedy of Duscur, something that would later be corroborated by Gilbert and a prisoner. Next, he responds to a request for aid from Claude and heads to Deirdre, where he kills Lord Arundel, who, unbeknownst to him, is actually Tallis, the leader of those who slither in the dark, inadvertently stopping them without even realizing it. Claude politely steps away from the story, allowing the more relevant characters to stay in the spotlight, and leaves to pursue his dreams, passing his relic, the Fail-Not, to us as he goes. Word of Arendel's defeat reaches Edelgard, who, although pleased by one of her problems being dealt with, realizes that her war has gotten more complicated. She orders her forces to pull back and maintain a tighter defense on the Empire, and hints at going to extreme measures to ensure her victory, despite Hubert's concern. After capturing Fort Mercius, a prisoner supposedly involved in the tragedy of Duscur is transferred into Dimitri's care. He interrogates the prisoner, who claims that his instructions were not to approach Patricia's carriage and leave her unharmed. Gilbert notes that this lines up with what Cornelia said as she died, as well as the intel that he's gathered from various other lords. Dimitri lets the prisoner speak, and while he clearly condemns the man's actions, he lets him live for now.
I will make that decision once I have had time to consider this man's definition of justice.
Before invading Enbar, Dimitri sends a messenger to Edelgard, hoping to have a personal conversation with her, to try and understand her vision for the war. To his surprise, Edelgard accepts his request, and the two of them meet under the supervision of Hubert and Byleth. Dimitri presses her reasons for starting the war, to which she replies that it was the only way forward. In her mind, it was the path that would lead to the fewest casualties, and the more options they tried before revolting, the more lives would have been claimed by this crooked world. They're unable to come to an agreement on the war, but before Edelgard leaves, Dimitri returns her dagger. Edelgard finally remembers the time she spent with Dimitri as a child, and thanks him for the gift, something she wasn't able to say back then. Before she and Hubert leave, she tells Dimitri this.
As for the future, that will be decided in battle. King of Fargus, as the Emperor, I shall await your arrival in Enbar.
After Dimitri takes Enbar and approaches the palace, Edelgard follows through on her extreme measure hinted at earlier, and transforms into Hegemon Edelgard, a potentially irreversible process. Despite this, Dimitri's assault on the palace is successful and she is defeated. Dimitri surprisingly extends his hand to the defeated Edelgard as if to show her mercy in defeat, but she refuses his sympathy and pulls out her dagger from her cloak. The exact exchange between them happens off-screen, but we hear a stabbing sound, and when the camera cuts back, Edelgard's dagger is buried in Dimitri's shoulder, and Dimitri's lance in Edelgard's torso. Dimitri removes the dagger and spear, dropping the dagger to the floor next to Edelgard's corpse as he and Byleth walk away, out of the throne room, and are greeted by cheering as they leave the palace. In the aftermath of the war, with the Empire defeated and control over the Alliance handed over to Dimitri, all of Fodlan was now under the kingdom's rule. Dimitri would finally be properly crowned as the new King of Fargus and would rule for the rest of his life. He was revered as a good leader, focused on improving foreign relations and living situations for orphans. In Crimson Flower, Byleth disregards Rhea's orders to kill Edelgard and instead vows to protect her. Edelgard is initially surprised, but realizes this is not the time to ask questions. Rhea transforms into a dragon, the Immaculate One, and Hubert suggests that we escape immediately. The Black Eagles retreat to an Imperial camp, and for the only time in the game, our social time is spent somewhere other than Garreg Mach. Edelgard asks everyone to reaffirm that they want to be here, and that they're willing to go against the Church of Seiros.
The Church of Seiros has great influence and power. Their control over the lords of the kingdom and the Alliance is nearly absolute. We are the only ones who can stop this indomitable enemy that has plagued our world for ages. We fight for humanity, for all of Fodlan. If you dare walk this path with me, take your first step. It's now or never.
Much like the other routes, Edelgard attacks Garreg Mach, except this time Byleth is on her side. The Church of Seiros is overpowered by the Imperial forces, and Rhea once again transforms into the Immaculate One and attacks Byleth, causing them to fall into a coma and forces the same 5-year time skip to happen. Despite this, the Church of Seiros is still forced to retreat, leaving the Empire to take over Garreg Mach, and Rhea retreats to Verdant in the Kingdom. As per usual, Byleth heads to Garreg Mach after awakening from their coma, where they find Edelgard mourning their disappearance 5 years ago. As Garreg Mach was never abandoned this time, there's no bandits squatting in it to kill, and Edelgard fills us in on what's happened. The war has reached a stalemate. The Kingdom of Fargus, led by Dimitri, has allied with the Church, and the Alliance has tried to maintain a neutral stance. After a quick reunion with the Black Eagles, Edelgard begins to discuss our next moves. Eliminate the Alliance before moving on to fight the Kingdom and the Church. She marches her army onto Deirdre, where she defeats Claude, effectively defeating the Alliance. But Claude can either be spared or killed. If Claude is killed, Edelgard justifies it as a necessary casualty. She believed that certain factions would perpetually fight the Empire had he lived, and his death kept bloodshed to a minimum. If he is spared, he behaves similarly to Azure Moon and just kinda exits the game, leaving Edelgard confused about his mentality. Me too, to be honest. With the Alliance dealt with, Edelgard shifts her focus to clearing up a couple of her other problems. She defends Garreg Mach from an attack by Seteth and Flayn, and invades Arianrod, killing Cornelia and Rodrigue in the process. Arundel pays a visit to Garreg Mach shortly afterwards to question Cornelia's death, and he and Edelgard dance around the necessity of it. Before leaving, he leaves Edelgard with this.
I will be praying that the Empire will not become another Aryan Road.
Edelgard is confused, but just after Arundel leaves, Hubert arrives with news that pillars of light rained down on Arianrod and disintegrated it. Edelgard connects the dots and realizes that this must have been Arundel's revenge for her killing Cornelia. She takes this information and manipulates it, telling her army that the Church of Seiros were the ones responsible for the destruction of Arianrod, further motivating them in her war. With her army rallied, Edelgard begins her march towards Verdant to strike at Rhea. Scouts inform Rhea of Edelgard's movement, and she asks Dimitri about his plans. He laments the death of Rodrigue and announces his plan to intercept them himself, requesting that Rhea positions her forces so that she can flank the Imperial army. Edelgard predicts that they'll be intercepted at Taeltian Plains, and Hubert requests that she refrain from being on the front lines. Edelgard is their target, so it makes sense to hide her out of their reach, but Edelgard refuses, saying that her and the Black Eagles were the only ones who could do this.
Had to be me. Someone else might have gotten it wrong.
As expected, Dimitri awaits us at Taeltian Plains, and both he and Edelgard announce their resolve to kill the other. Unbeknownst to Dimitri, Didiu had secretly given their soldiers crest stones, so some of them transform into demonic beasts throughout the fight. Dimitri disapproves, but what's done is done, so he expresses the need to claim victory so that their deaths were not in vain. As it's her route, Edelgard of course comes out on top in the fight, and depending on if Didiu turned into a demonic beast before being defeated, we get to see one of two scenes. If he didn't turn, he searches the bodies for Dimitri and pours his heart out, thanking Dimitri for all that he's done for him. Dimitri acknowledges Didiu and regrets being unable to get revenge for the dead before passing away. If Didiu did transform, we instead get a scene between Edelgard and Dimitri. Dimitri screams at her, seeming to have descended into the madness that plagued him in the other routes, but Edelgard shuts him down and takes his life.
Your obsession with me is appalling. If you were a normal human, you would most certainly have died already. Farewell, King of Delusion. If only we were born in a time of peace, you might have lived a joyful life as a benevolent ruler.
To the fires of eternity with you, El.
With Dimitri out of the way, Edelgard continues marching on to Verdant, chasing after Rhea, who had fled from Taeltian Plains following Dimitri's defeat. Before laying siege to the capital, Edelgard pulls Byleth aside to have a heart-to-heart conversation. She's realized what Byleth is, a descendant of the goddess Sothis, and reveals that she was scared of Byleth choosing Rhea over her. Of course we'd never do that, right? At Verdant, she offers Rhea and the Church of Seiros the opportunity to surrender, and briefly holds off on her attack to give citizens time to evacuate before they're caught in the crossfire. Rhea refuses to give in and orders Catherine to set the city ablaze, intending to catch the Imperial army in the fires, and transforms into the Immaculate One last time. Realizing that Rhea will stop at nothing to take her down, Edelgard calls for an invasion of the city, with Rhea being the primary target. After a hard-fought battle, Edelgard and Byleth stand face-to-face with an exhausted Rhea and strike at her head with their relics, killing her and putting an end to her corruption. Byleth collapses after the fight due to their ties to the goddess, seemingly dying, causing Edelgard to weep. However, they get back up for reasons that I am not going to delve into in this video, greatly overjoying Edelgard. With the Church of Seiros defeated, Edelgard was finally able to begin dismantling the crest system, giving opportunities to everyone regardless of their birth status. Also, since she no longer shared a goal with those who slither in the dark, she was finally able to break her ties with them and wage war in their direction, hopefully being able to defeat them for good. Before I get into an analysis of the characters, I want to talk about the writing of the game first, and specifically my problems with it, as it plays a large role in how we perceive the characters. One of the game's flaws is that while the character writing is generally quite good, the storytelling suffers quite frequently. The three lords were not created equally, with Edelgard and Dimitri getting way more attention than Claude, who feels kind of tacked on in some parts. Dimitri and Claude just feel hopeless without Byleth, and while it works well for Dimitri's story, Claude just kinda gives up at the earliest possible opportunity in non-Verdant Wind routes. So why am I going over all of this, especially devoting time to Claude when we're supposed to be discussing Edelgard and Dimitri? Well, writing is complicated. And when the storytelling works against the character development like Three Houses does, analysis can become difficult and frustrating. And these difficulties don't arise from the complexity of the characters. While it's true that many of them are complex and fall somewhere along the morally gray scale rather than being black or white, the issues really come from the game failing to capitalize on what it sets up, disregarding a lot of what it starts and forgetting to give us any payoffs. Edelgard's route, Crimson Flower, is probably the worst offender of this, where she's supposed to be the main character, but the game just conveniently forgets about anything she did in White Clouds. Flane's kidnapping, Ramire Village, Kranya murdering Geralt, hell, even the bandits in the prologue in Chapter 2. These are all things that she at least has some indirect responsibility for due to her alliance with those who slither in the dark, but only Geralt's death is even acknowledged later on, and everything else is either forgotten about or hand-waved off-screen. The game tries to tell 4 stories, but it feels almost afraid to commit to any one of them most of the time. Dancing around Edelgard being the Flame Emperor created a lot of moments that worked well in hindsight in the Black Eagles routes, but I suppose in an effort to not spoil the twist for anyone talking to a friend playing a different route, they decided to give these moments to all 3 routes. I mentioned earlier how the worst narrative moment in the entire game takes place just after the battle at Remire Village.
Gerald, Professor, have you seen Claude?
Well, this moment fits in extremely well in the Black Eagles route. It makes perfect sense for Hubert to distract us to let Edelgard get away since he knows her true identity. Hell, after playing through the first route, I made notes for a section talking about how intelligence systems foreshadowed Edelgard's identity as the Flame Emperor. Immediately after, when we're talking to Edelgard at Garreg Mach, I noticed her outfit had the same color scheme as the Flame Emperor, and then remembered she was absent during the Flame Emperor's other appearance when we went to find Flame. I thought it was a really cool detail to include for anyone who is a little bit observant.
But it all was bullshit!
After going through the Academy phase with the other 2 houses, I realized I hadn't actually solved anything. Claude and Dimitri have this exact same foreshadowing, minus the color scheme matching, but the only difference is there's no payoff. They're both missing during the search for Flame, and both mysteriously vanish for seemingly no reason after Remire Village. And unlike Hubert, who has a good reason to distract us, it's just confusing when Hilda and Didiu interrupt what should obviously be an important conversation, completely stealing our attention long enough for the Flame Emperor, a critical enemy, to escape. And Azure Moon makes it feel all completely pointless anyways, since the game all but tells us who the Flame Emperor is when we're eavesdropping on her conversation with Kranya and Talus in Chapter 10. And don't get me wrong, I think it's a fantastic scene for the route, and it really helps to set Azure Moon apart from the other routes, but if we're gonna do this, why go to the effort to undermine the setups we have in Crimson Flower? It just makes them feel meaningless in retrospect, and meanwhile in Azure Moon we have some genuine foreshadowing unique to the route. And on a similar note, Edelgard's death is identical in both Silver Snow and Verdant Wind, right down to her line about wanting to walk with us, but within the context of Verdant Wind it doesn't make a whole lot of sense. In Silver Snow, we'd spent 10 months working closely with her and building up a relationship with her before her betrayal, so it makes sense that she might be nostalgic for us and remember us fondly in her final moments. But in Verdant Wind, it just comes out of nowhere with no emotional weight behind it. No significant bonding moments have happened between her and Byleth in the story, support ranks beyond C+ aren't even available on Verdant Wind. So why is Byleth suddenly this long-lost friend worthy of occupying her dying thoughts? And much like the foreshadowing, it retroactively diminishes the impact of this moment in Silver Snow by giving it to us when it hasn't earned its place here. And I think the strained storytelling is a big reason why there's so much discourse regarding certain characters, Edelgard in particular. In trying to give everyone the spotlight, resources were stretched too thin and nobody really got the spotlight, disproportionately affecting Edelgard as she's the main villain in 3 of 4 routes. And the one route where she's supposed to be the good guy feels rushed and doesn't address half the things that it feels like it should. Rhea works as a climactic final boss for her route, but to just see, to ensure lasting peace, the 2 fought against those who slither in the dark, as the sole resolution for that questionable alliance feels like a slap in the face. Her involvement with them was such a major part of her character, and yet we completely miss seeing what she does about them. Hubert brings up their alliance to Byleth to explain why they feel forced to ally with Gerald's killers. Arundel pops up from time to time, and Edelgard lies about their involvement in Arianrod. So they're clearly not forgotten about post-time skip, but the story just continues to set things up and forgets to provide a payoff. She faces no real consequences in Crimson Flower, either politically or socially, from working with those who slither in the dark. Byleth seemingly just accepts Hubert's explanation and never confronts Edelgard about Gerald's death, and the lie about Arianrod is never brought up again. This obviously isn't an exhaustive list of my problems with the storytelling, as that's not the focus of the video, but I just wanted to give a few examples demonstrating why some characters, again, Edelgard in particular, became particularly polarizing due to feeling incomplete, I guess. I guess what I'm trying to say here is take my opinions with a grain of salt, because not everything's gonna have good answers. The idea for this video originally started as an analysis on Edelgard, as I had heard about her before starting the game, and she clearly filled the role of the villain in the first route I did, Silver Snow. However, as I continued through the rest of the routes, Azure Moon in particular, I noticed that in many ways Dimitri acted as a bit of a foil to her. They had the familial relation of being step-siblings, no, neither of them are stuck, and developed a rivalry that grew over the course of the game. They're set up as leaders of opposing houses, the framing of the cutscene at the ball almost makes it feel like they're competing, and they're the boss of either the last or second to last chapter of each other's route. Where's Claude, you might ask? In addition, I felt that narratively they fill opposite roles, with Edelgard acting as an anti-villain in the non-Crimson Flower routes and Dimitri an anti-hero in Azure Moon. Quick definitions: an anti-villain does evil in the pursuit of good, and an anti-hero does good in the pursuit of evil. A bit reductive or simplistic, but you get the idea. Edelgard's ultimate goal is actually quite noble. She wants to dismantle the crest system that elevates certain individuals or families above the rest of the population because they happen to get lucky, while also freeing the nobles from their obligation burdened upon them as the result of having a crest. Dorothea is an example of someone who suffered under the crest system, as she didn't come from a noble family and she wasn't born with a crest, so as a result she had to grow up poor and live as a street urchin. And yet she's clearly very talented. She's a talented actress and singer, and she attends Garreg Officers Academy. She's the perfect example of someone that could be elevated in the meritocracy that Edelgard wishes to create. Alternatively, we have characters like Marianne or Lysithea, who hate the fact that they were born with crests and would love to lead a simpler life away from the spotlight of nobility. And speaking of Lysithea, those who slither in the dark put her through similar experiments to Edelgard, but obviously she had a different response to her trauma. And she really does believe in her cause. She has no desire to rule over Fodlan as a tyrant or force extremist views onto the people. She simply identifies a problem and is willing to do whatever it takes to get there, even if it means risking her own life, even if it means sacrificing the relationship she has, even if it means sacrificing her own citizens. She truly lacks the desire for power or fame, as evidenced in her Solo and Hubert endings, where she passes her work on to a successor and vanishes from the public eye. But this is where things get complicated, and why I call her an anti-villain. She has a noble goal, but to her, the ends very much justify the means. The road to hell is paved with good intentions, and ultimately, Edelgard does go to fairly extreme measures in her pursuit of equality. In declaring war on the Knights of Seiros, she effectively declares war on the whole of Fodlan as well. She hires bandits to slaughter the Officers Academy students, and they're only stopped because Byleth and Geralt are coincidentally nearby. She allies with those who slither in the dark, despite her trauma with them, as conveniently for her, they also have their own reasons for wanting the church gone. And despite what happened to Geralt, she, well, Hubert, but her by extension, asks Byleth to set aside their father's murder and work alongside his murderers. Dimitri, on the other hand, is more self-serving, and his mind is clouded by revenge. In our first meeting with him, Byleth notes that he seems quite sincere, but has a darkness lurking beneath. He was scarred by the tragedy of Duscur and longs for retribution, but this clouds his own judgment. His support with Felix talks about a rebellion that he quashed 2 years before the game, where he slaughtered the opposition and loved it. According to Felix, he bore an expression that had all the world's evil packed into it, and that the Dimitri he knew died in Duscur, with only a beast remaining. He finds himself fighting for the quote-unquote right side of history from 3 out of 4 routes perspectives, but not necessarily because he's fighting for the good of Fodlan. The only reason he joined the Officers Academy was to get revenge for the dead. Not to better lead the Kingdom of Fargus, not to form alliances with the eventual leaders of the Adrestian Empire or the Leicester Alliance, but for his own selfish reasons. Prior to Rodrigue's dying words in Azure Moon snapping him back to reality, he's purely hell-bent on destruction, and just so happens to be on the side against Edelgard's war, and this is why I call him an anti-hero. Had he thought the Church of Seiros or the Leicester Alliance responsible for the tragedy of Duscur, perhaps his allegiance would have lied with Edelgard instead. But because his end goals line up with ours 75% of the time, he conveniently fights with us. Also, I didn't know where in the video to put this, and it's completely unrelated to anything else, but Google Docs wanted to correct Verdiad to Florida, and then I couldn't stop thinking about Dimitri being featured in a Florida Man headline, so I had to pass this on to all of you.
His intentions were as clear as day. You will prove a lacking ruler if you cannot see the truth behind a person's words.
You will prove a lacking ruler yourself if you look for deceit behind every word and fail to trust those whom you rely on.
This conversation happens right at the start of the game, and I was shocked to realize just how well it holds up throughout. It happens because of Claude's behavior when they were attacked by bandits in the prologue. Dimitri comments on how he thought Claude was acting as a decoy while Edelgard thought it was clear that he was running away. Edelgard is painted as a pessimist who has trouble trusting people, as opposed to Dimitri's optimism. Well, at least outside of his period of complete insanity. Throughout the game, Edelgard is hesitant to form alliances with people. She has fewer supports than both Dimitri and Claude, and she actively pushes Byleth away if they express any interest in allying with the Flame Emperor. Even among her allies, she demonstrates a lack of trust, evidenced when she doesn't let the rest of the Black Eagles know the truth behind Arianrod. Not even her closest allies who had stuck with her since the Garreg Mach days were privy to the truth, even if she planned to tell the public a different version to rally them behind her war on the Church. And speaking of the Church, if you look for deceit behind every word could not apply more to her relationship with the Church of Seiros. Rhea gets zero benefit of the doubt at any point, and Edelgard scrutinizes every piece of information she ever learns about them, instead blindly believing the version of history passed down through the emperors, and assuming every aspect of the Church's story is false. Dimitri, on the other hand, is much more optimistic about relying on other people. He has a few more supports than Edelgard, demonstrating an easier ability for him to form bonds with others. He eventually listens to reason and allows others to bring him back to reality. He takes the advice of his allies and lets his war plan be changed by other people's opinions when switching gears to retake Verdiad. Although taking words at face value does bite him a bit at one point, when he hears Tala's mention the word Duscur to the Flame Emperor, causing him to form an incorrect association with the tragedy and Edelgard. As I've alluded to, Edelgard has been one of the more divisive characters in the game, so I wanted to take a moment and talk about some of her more contentious points. First up, we have the infamous Arianrod lie. With the information available to her, it's quite clear that Lord Arundel was the one responsible for the destruction of the city, yet she keeps this information between herself, Hubert, and Byleth, instead telling the rest of the Black Eagles that the Church were the ones who done it. And if you go search forum threads about this, you will definitely find people having completely rational and civilized conversations on the matter. Now, as a disclaimer, and I'm sure this may be incredibly shocking to find out, I'm not a military strategist nor a politician, so I'm not going to claim that my interpretations are the only correct ones. At this point in the story, those who slither in the dark were still, well, slithering in the dark. The general population was unaware of their existence, and keeping that fact a secret for now was a calculated maneuver by Edelgard. She wanted to remain focused on the task at hand, which was taking out the Church of Seiros, and didn't want to distract the public with knowledge of a second enemy. This could have fractured her supporters and potentially even her army, weakening her assault on the Church as they wonder why those who slither in the dark are allowed to run free. Additionally, she probably wants to try and stay on Talos' good side to not risk a last-second betrayal. She'd already tested their alliance a few times, especially once she killed Cornelia, and there would be moments when the Imperial army would be at their weakest, particularly right after killing Rhea, where a surprise attack from those who slither in the dark could have completely devastated them. Now, does it make her a hypocrite like so many people like to politely argue? Well, yeah, probably. One of her major issues she brings up about the Church is how they rewrote history regarding the Nemesis conflict. The Church claims Nemesis was corrupted by his power and turned evil, but Edelgard believes this to be a revised history and believes the Empire's story about it being little more than a simple dispute. By lying about the true cause of Arianrod, she's resorting to the exact same tactics that she was accusing the Church of. I'm not judging whether she was right or wrong to lie about Arianrod. I can certainly see arguments for both sides, but she's setting a double standard here where it's okay for her to do so because of reasons, while completely disregarding the thought that the Church could also have had similar reasons for perpetuating what she perceived to be a lie. That being said, I do believe it's still in line with other aspects of her character. From the start of the game, she's always acknowledged that sacrifices are necessary to change the world, and that any sacrifices made today will lead to a better future where sacrifices may not be needed. To her, this lie is just another sacrifice she sees as necessary to lead to a brighter Fodlan. Moving on to another hot question. Is Edelgard a fascist? I can kind of see where the question comes from, but fascism does have a fairly specific definition, so let's quickly run through Umberto Eco's 14 points and see if anything applies to Edelgard. Cult of tradition? No. Rejection of modernity? No. Irrationalism? No. Disagreement is treason? No. Fear of difference? Maybe. Her disdain for the Nabateans could potentially qualify her here. We might need a bit more context, though. Appeal to a frustrated middle class? Kind of, but not really in the way that Umberto Eco defined it. Nationalism? No. The enemy is both strong and weak? No. Pacifism is treason? No. Elitism? No. Cult of heroism? No. Machismo? Hell no. Selective populism? I'll give her this. She does personally have a bit of a hero complex and forces her war on the Church of Seiros onto the rest of the Empire without consulting with her people. Newspeak? No. There are arguments that she could tick a few of these boxes, but by and large, Edelgard does not follow the playbook, and even pushes for the exact opposite on several of the points. Again, I'm also not a political scientist, so perhaps my interpretations are way off, but personally, I can't see how she could be considered a fascist by any stretch of the definition.
And the enemy of our enemy is, well, I think you sufficiently understand by now.
A major ideology that both Edelgard and Dimitri follow is the concept of the enemy of my enemy is my friend, and Hubert even alludes to this ideology in Crimson Flower when trying to justify their alliance with those who slither in the dark to Byleth. To both of them, the ends justify the means, so they don't care who they ally with as long as they achieve their goal in the end. For Edelgard, this obviously describes her alliance with those who slither in the dark, as we just mentioned. She's aware of the questionable acts they've committed, but to her, they're the lesser of the two evils present at the time, and as they conveniently share a goal, she chooses to ally with them. Hubert points out that the Church of Seiros is too powerful to be defeated with the Empire's might alone, so the power and support offered by those who slither in the dark were essential for their success. This obviously has consequences like Geralt dying at Cronya's hand and Fort Mercius or Arianrod being destroyed by the Javelins of Light, but shutting down the Church of Seiros is just that much more important to her, so she keeps them around until her goal is achieved. But did she have to do this? Was allying herself with those who slither in the dark really necessary? Hubert states that without them, the Empire would not have the strength to take on the Church of Seiros, but I have a hard time believing this to be the only solution. Again, as much as I hate to keep bringing up the point, the game does a poor job of justifying this one way or another. We're missing a significant chunk of Edelgard's life before the Officers' Academy, as well as pretty much the entirety of the time skip, so we don't know exactly what pressures Edelgard was facing that made her feel they were the only option. And she makes it clear that she disapproves of their actions and even actively works against them at times. She aids in defeating Sullen and Kranya, and she pulls back the Death Knight during the mission to extract Flayn's blood. I'll discuss this a bit more in the next section so as to not go too off topic, but first, Dimitri. With Dimitri, the enemy of his enemy is a bit more unsuspecting, as it's us.
I should have known that one day you would be haunting me as well.
From the time skip up until Gronder Field, Dimitri doesn't have any real loyalty to anyone except for the dead. Hell, he even shows disdain for us, refusing to interact with anyone at the monastery and even threatening us should we get in his way. And yet, he still stays around because he knows Byleth can help him. He knows that a one-man army versus the Empire isn't gonna take Edelgard's life, so he sticks with us. Aiding us in combat because he knows that winning control over Imperial territories will bring him one step closer to killing Edelgard. And although it may seem like it at some points, it's not that he hates us, it's just that he's not of sound mind and doesn't care about anyone except for the dead, so therefore any alliance he formed would naturally be like this. A big part of Edelgard's story comes down to her unique position stuck between two perceived threats. The Church of Seiros, the faction supposedly responsible for the crest system that has so drastically affected Edelgard and her family, and those who slither in the dark, the faction that intentionally caused all this trauma for Edelgard by abusing the existence of the crest system already in place. Edelgard has to pick one of them to focus on at first, as it's clear that the Empire lacks the strength to take on both at once, and she evidently chose the Church of Seiros as the greater of two evils. Whether or not she's right in identifying the Church as a problem is irrelevant here, but I do want to focus on the fact that she chose to deal with them before those who slither in the dark. This decision causes her to never see the realization of either of these factions being shut down in 3 out of 4 routes, and absolutely enables those who slither in the dark to get away with certain things as mentioned earlier. And to me, this is the most interesting point of conflict with her character, as it really showcases her values in an interesting way. Edelgard really doesn't half-ass things. When she has a goal, she's determined to see it through to the end or die trying. She's unwilling to compromise her ideals and refuses to settle for only a partially saved Fodlan. She needs to tear it all down before it can be rebuilt from the ground up. Trying to shift her alliances at some point to side with any of the Church, Kingdom, or Alliance would probably have been her smartest option if her goal was simply taking out those who slither in the dark, but that was only one of the 2 major issues plaguing Fodlan in her eyes. It doesn't solve the massive status disparity that crests are already causing, and surely someone else will arise in their place to perform more awful experiments. Regardless of whether or not I approve of her actions, which, for the record, definitely a couple shady things in there, I have to at least respect her determination to create the best version of Fodlan, but at some point you do have to look at the scope and question whether it's all worth it. Reforming an entire nation is a massive undertaking, even for the Emperor of the Adrestian Empire, evidenced by the fact that she had to go to such shady alliances to achieve it. But what if these alliances enabled things beyond her control? What if Kostas had killed not just Claude and Dimitri, but herself as well? What if those who slither in the dark played their cards a little bit smarter? What if they offered greater protections to Cornelia? Or what if they had secretly offered some support to the Church of Seiros to keep the Empire and the Church distracted and fighting each other, and managed to buy enough time to resurrect Nemesis like they did in Verdant Wind? I personally view her plan as somewhat reckless, with too great a risk of critical failure. In trying to solve every issue, the risk of solving nothing skyrocketed. Cindered Shadows does give us a bit more information about the damage done to Fodlan by the Church of Seiros, which could serve to justify Edelgard's stance a bit more, assuming she was aware of any of this, but perhaps that's a topic for a video on Rhea. This one's getting long enough as it is. And now I must beg the question, was the war even necessary to begin with? Edelgard clearly views it as necessary to abolish the crest system, but was it the only way? The game doesn't do the greatest job at justifying this one way or another, so let's look at what it does give us to see what inferences can be made. I want to take a look at Sylvain here, as he's one of the nobles who had his life significantly impacted by crests. He was the heir to House Gautier, despite having an older brother, Miquelon, simply because Sylvain was the one who inherited the crest. Miquelon became jealous and even tried to kill Sylvain and was disowned by House Gautier as a result. His support with Mercedes shows that he truly does hate crests with a passion, and this is reflected in several of his endings. His solo ending, or his endings with Ingrid, Mercedes, and Dorothea all include a line about how nobles were convinced that relics and crests were no longer viewed as necessary, regardless of the route you chose. To me, this demonstrates the possibility of another solution. We obviously don't know exactly what Sylvain did, how he did it, or even how the circumstances of the world lined up to convince the nobles of this. But even in a time where Edelgard failed, Sylvain takes a solid first step. Now, Edelgard may very well have been concerned about her shortened lifespan. As we've hinted at, and we'll go over in a bit more depth later, she doesn't seem to place the utmost amount of trust on anyone other than Byleth, so perhaps she wanted to see her goal through in her own lifetime, rather than risk her vision dying out after her own passing. Or maybe even if she felt the nobles of today could be convinced, would the nobles of tomorrow remain so? So she wanted to create a world where the crest system couldn't fail it, even after she lost the ability to look after it. Can't abuse the crests if there are no crests. Oh yeah, Dimitri was also in this video. Apologies, Edelgard just had a lot to talk about. A quote that I've brought up before in my Handsome Jack video, and one that I'm sure will continue to be relevant to countless villains in media, is one by Friedrich Nietzsche. Whoever fights monsters should see to it that in the process he does not become a monster. And if you gaze long enough into an abyss, the abyss will gaze back into you. I really like this quote when talking about Dimitri, especially in Azure Moon, as I feel it perfectly reflects his spiral into madness for the war phase. Like everything with Dimitri, it all began with the tragedy of Duscur.
The way you suppressed that rebellion, it was ruthless slaughter, and you loved every second. I remember the way you killed your victims, how you watched them suffer. And your face, that expression, all the world's evil packed into it. Well then. I suppose the Dimitri I once knew died during that slaughter in Duscur, along with my brother.
Dimitri then spends his time after Duscur fighting monsters, staring deep into that abyss. Felix describes the look on his face when quashing a rebellion 2 years before the start of the game as containing all the world's evil. Dimitri admits that he only came to the Officers' Academy to get revenge for Duscur. He recognizes the attackers at Ramire Village as the same ones at Duscur. He overhears Talas mention the word Duscur to the Flame Emperor. He watches as Edelgard reveals herself to be the Flame Emperor. He's framed for the murder of his uncle and imprisoned for years. Dimitri is left with no choice but to fight monsters constantly while trying to get solace for the dead. But this whole time, his composure has been worn down by the constant betrayals. The abyss begins to stare back at him.
Someone must put a stop to this cycle of the strong trampling the weak. Or do you condone their actions? Do you believe that the pillaging and slaughtering those rats live for is justified? It is reprehensible, and they must be put down. I intend to give them a taste of the pain they have inflicted on others. Even if it means becoming a rat myself, I swore to at least do that much. I will not let them down.
Despite this, though, Dimitri is entirely aware of it. Unlike when I referenced the quote in my Handsome Jack video, Dimitri isn't the hero of his own story. He has no delusions that his name is going down in the history books as the great savior of Fodlan, and he's content with that. He just wants justice for the dead and to see Edelgard's head separated from her shoulders. I'd like to linger a moment on Felix and Dimitri's relationship, as I think it's one of the best ones in the game. Both of them suffered major losses as a result of the tragedy of Duscur, although Dimitri obviously more so. But like Lysithea and Edelgard, the two of them respond very differently to their loss.
My father, my friends, Glenn, they all meant a great deal to me. And they were all brutally slaughtered. I alone survived. If I do not shoulder the anguish and regret they must have felt, who will?
Dimitri holds a very traditional approach to honoring the dead. The dead cannot bear their own burdens, so if everyone else forgets about them, then their deaths will be meaningless. So, in order to keep their memories alive, Dimitri forces himself to bear their burdens and remember their sadness, because nobody else will. However, Felix takes a very different approach.
The dead won't acknowledge your loyalty. They don't care. What a load of bunk it is, pretending to serve a corpse. You're serving your own ego.
You are wrong.
No, I'm not. The dead are dead. The living are living. You have to respect that boundary. If you keep stringing gravestones around your neck, you'll snap.
He thinks Dimitri's approach is all performative, meant simply to stroke his own ego. To Felix, there's no use wallowing in pain for the lost. In his mind, living exclusively for the dead disrespects what they died for. By ignoring your own needs and living in the past, their deaths won't have accomplished anything. And by not respecting the boundary between the living and the dead, the weight of all the tombstones slung around your neck cause it to snap, enabling the abyss to look back at you as you transform into a monster. Now, Dimitri does end up coming around to Felix's way of thinking after being brought back to reality by Rodrigue's death. He's still firm in his resolution to kill Edelgard, but allows himself to make his own decisions, and finally prioritize the living, putting off his pursuit of Edelgard to reclaim his kingdom's capital.
I will no longer allow the voices of the dead to bind me. This is something that I must do. No. Something that I am choosing to do.
On the topic of supports, both Edelgard and Dimitri have a lot of character development hidden away in them, so let's take a look at their supports and find out what we can learn. Starting with Edelgard's support with Byleth, it reveals a softer side behind the cold Empress persona that she puts on. In her C and C+ supports, we see her being vulnerable in front of Byleth, recounting the traumas she went through at the hands of those who slither in the dark. Her B rank expresses her frustrations regarding leading the Empire and how she sometimes wishes she could just be a normal girl for a day. And in her A rank, she grants us a permission previously allowed only to her closest family, and lets us call her by a nickname, L. I mentioned earlier how reserved Edelgard is when it comes to trusting people, so it's really quite significant that she allows Byleth into her life like this. Her supports with many of the Black Eagles show off her more authoritative side, which is a bit more in line with what we might expect to see from her. She calls out Linhardt for being lazy, reprimands and makes an example out of Ferdinand for his insistence on dueling her, and forces Bernadetta to explain why she was following her. And this reflects her presence in the main story as well, where she often tries to be the most important person in a conversation. And at the same time, she demonstrates a nurturing or almost motherly side. In her own weird way, at least. For Linhardt, she's concerned that his laziness is wasting his talent. She encourages Bernadetta to break out of her shell, relating some of her own fears, hoping to help Bernadetta realize that not everybody's perfect. With Lysithea, she relates to her about the Crest experiments and encourages her to never give up fighting against the Crest system.
Good girl. Now then, would you care for a sweet cake?
Many of her A ranks demonstrate her ability to grow and acknowledge misconceptions that she may have had. In Caspar's A rank, she realizes that her whole perspective of him was incorrect. She was taken aback by how easygoing he seemed and how simplistic his needs were, and assumed there must be something else going on, but that's really just how he was. With Hanneman, she apologizes for investigating his past, having not believed the reasons he gave for why he left the Empire to research crests with the kingdom. To Manuela, she backs down a bit on her total hatred of the Church and admits that not everything it does is wrong, but it's still necessary to remove it in order to fix the issues with the world. Edelgard is a bit one-dimensional in the main story, only occasionally turning off her persona, so these A ranks give her some much-needed depth and character development. Dimitri expresses a similar attitude as Edelgard towards Byleth and their support. He feels comfortable opening up about very personal matters such as the loss of his family, his estrangement from his uncle, and his relationship with Rodrigue. Unlike Edelgard, though, it's not as surprising for him. As we mentioned earlier, Dimitri is a much more trusting person in general, so it makes sense that it'd be easier for him to open up to someone, especially during the earlier support ranks. I've already covered Felix's support, but I just want to reiterate that I truly think it's the best support in the game. It gives early context to the line from the paralogue, "He seems quite sincere, but I sense darkness lurking beneath," and foreshadows his much darker turn. Unlike Edelgard, who only talks about her trauma in Byleth and Lysithia's supports, and only willingly in one of them, Dimitri is much more open about his trauma, and it's a common topic amongst his supports. Obviously, the tragedy of Duscur is a much more public event than the experiments Edelgard and her siblings went through, so people were much more likely to bring it up, but he's still willing to discuss it with basically anyone who asks. It comes up in his supports with Byleth, Dedue, Felix, Mercedes, Ingrid, Flayn, Gilbert, Catherine, and Happy, and he's open to talk about it throughout the main story.
Mercedes, I am scared. So scared that I will forget their faces. The people who have died, who I have killed. I cannot let myself forget them. I know that, and yet... whatever my feelings, it is all the act of a monster.
Dimitri trusts almost anyone who asks with the knowledge of his burdens. Mercedes wished to know why he considers himself a monster, as she sees kindness in him, and he engages and opens up to her. He feels responsible for Glenn's death at the tragedy of Duscur, and feels indebted to Ingrid for the loss of her fiancé. He recognizes Marianne's sadness at being the sole survivor of her family, and relates his experiences to her.
It doesn't feel good, does it? To be the one left behind? You feel guilt for not dying along with the others.
And speaking of Marianne, her support is the perfect example of Dimitri and Edelgard's different approaches to supporting others. Edelgard maintains an air of authority while offering her support, nurturing those in need but maintaining a comfortable distance, while Dimitri jumps right down there with them, truly speaking from the heart, and treating them as a friend rather than a subordinate. Edelgard tries to pass on her wisdom, while Dimitri tries to pass on his feelings. They unfortunately don't share any supports outside of Byleth, so direct comparisons aren't possible, so we'll have to make do. Take Bernadetta and Edelgard's support and compare it to Dimitri and Marianne's support. Bernadetta tries to watch Edelgard from a distance to learn from her, but she finds her intimidating and tries to hide from her. Edelgard tries to understand her and opens up a bit about her own fears, but her tone and choice of words clearly indicate that she considers herself to be Bernadetta's superior. Marianne similarly tries to keep distance between her and Dimitri, but we can immediately see a difference in Dimitri's approach. He makes much more of an effort to relate directly to Marianne, and so his attempts at consoling her feel a lot more personal. He has direct experience with the emotions she's feeling, so he's easily able to relate to her and flips the conversation back around, making her the focal point of it. Where Edelgard insists upon her point, Dimitri insists on comfort, and he even cracks a joke, playing on something Marianne had said earlier. And genuinely standing up for others is a common trend in his supports. He notices a couple soldiers being racist towards people from Duscur, Dedue in particular, and he leaps in to confront them and defend his friend. Ash offers to help repair a tent, and Dimitri insists on repaying him by getting him some sweets. With Sylvain, he disapproves of his behaviors, but compromises and strikes a deal with him. In exchange for Sylvain behaving himself better, Dimitri promises to try and loosen up and have a bit more fun. Flayn was feeling down about her cooking, so Dimitri asks her to cook him a meal and praises it, despite the fact that he's mostly lost his sense of taste.
Besides, I can tell you put a lot of love and dedication into preparing this food for everyone. That alone makes it taste good.
There is no need for false flattery.
Next up, let's take a look at their names and where they take inspiration from to see if they line up with anything about the character. Edelgard comes from German and literally means noble guard, reflecting her status of nobility and how she strives to guard the citizens of Fodlan from the corruption of the crest system and the Church of Seiros. Her last name, Hresvel, comes from a Norse giant said to be capable of transforming into an eagle that created wind when he flapped his wings. I don't know if there's anything in particular about her last name that lines up with her character, but if you can come up with something, then please let me know. As for Dimitri, I think his etymology takes us in some more interesting directions. His first name, Dimitri, comes from the Greek Demetrius, which means follower of Demeter. Demeter is the goddess of the harvest and agriculture, and is the daughter to Titans Rhea and Cronus. Fittingly, Dimitri comes from the Holy Kingdom of Fargus, a nation with heavy ties to the Church of Seiros that is, coincidentally, headed by Archbishop Rhea. In every route, the kingdom opposes Edelgard and the Empire, so Dimitri therefore always fights on the same side as Rhea. Alexander also has its origins in ancient Greek, coming from Alexandros, meaning protector or defender of men. Dimitri strives to be a protector of sorts, although primarily for the memories of the dead for most of his story. And finally, Blaethid comes from a mythical king of the Britons, Bladud, or Blythid in Welsh, and the name directly translates to Wolf Lord. Sadly, Dimitri doesn't lead the Blue Wolves house, and Felix loves calling him a boar, so we slightly missed out there. But wolves are commonly associated with the moon, and Dimitri's route is Azure Moon, so there's that. It could also be a nod to Dimitri's lone wolf mentality that he has after being mentally broken over the time skip. While they seem to be very different at their core, Edelgard and Dimitri are quite interesting to look at next to each other. An anti-villain from one perspective could be seen as an anti-hero from another, and vice versa. But there's still the ultimate question: who was right? Well, it's Byleth. Dimitri and Rhea just kind of forget how to function properly without Byleth's presence. Edelgard loses the plot a bit on her own, and Claude just kind of gives up. But in every single route, Byleth is right there leading Fodlan to a seemingly brighter future. Many of the characters' endings are identical or virtually identical no matter the route, with differences often simply being Byleth's role in the new world, or mentioning different living characters. Although, I guess I'm asking the wrong question. My channel is called Video Game Villains, after all. So, who was wrong? Who's the real villain in all of this? The fans. It's definitely the fans. The fans who attack others for having their own preferences or opinions. The fans who insist that their way of viewing things is the only correct way. The fans who are afraid to admit that the world is just simply more nuanced than good versus evil, and try to reduce every discussion to dunking on others and drag it away from having any actual discussion happening. Don't be that guy. Nobody likes that guy.